Okay, we are in the book of Esther. I'm going to be looking at Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2. Fairly lengthy, but that should not be anything new to most of you. Esther chapter 2. Find your way there. Esther chapter 2, starting in verse 1, says this. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. She had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, and had charge over the women, who had charge over the women. And the young women pleased him, and the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and a portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women at the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into the king Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations of the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young women went into the king in this way, when the young woman went into the king this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in custody of Shahaggaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her in his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants, It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts to the royal with royal generosity. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right. So, what do you think our society believes are the most important qualities in a person? Yeah, just in general, what do you think? What do you think some of the qualities that society as a whole think are important in a person? Looks are important. Did you say looks too? Looks. That's a big one, right? Looks are super important. What else? You were hoping for honesty, but sure. Trustworthy. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Might, power. Maybe those are some qualities. People that show a lot of initiative, show that they're in control. Some people like that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of different characteristics, qualities that a lot of people think are important in society. So what did the king's attendants purpose and why in verses 1 through 4? What's going on in 1 through 4? What did they say? What did they propose? What did they say? Hey, why don't we do this?
When is she not supposed to talk about her feelings background?
Well, that would be Esther, yeah. But in verses 1 through 4, we have the king's attendants, the king's, the counselors, the people that are going to talk to the king. What do they say? What do they propose, and why do they propose it? What? They're going to look for a new queen. Yeah.
Remember her. So they're like, let's fix this.
Yes. Now you remember, this was a big drinking party. And a lot of times, kings back then, they would put decrees and laws and all that into effect while they were intoxicated, and then it would be ratified afterwards. And you couldn't, the laws of the Persians and the Medes, you could not change the law. If you put something, and we saw this when we looked at Daniel in the sermon, right? A couple weeks back, when the king put the decree out that nobody could worship or pray to any other god or any other person but him for 30 days. And then he finds out his best guy is worshiping his God, is going to follow his God. You know, he's heartbroken over it. He's upset. He's, you know, yes, he was a pagan king, but he couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't change the laws. So the same thing's going on here. So you could see, I mean, we could talk about this, right? Probably a good idea not to be out of your right mind, because that's when we make. So being on drugs, being on alcohol, and those kinds of things get us out of the right mindset, and we start to make bad decisions. And the king does that, right? Because
the idea, though, that maybe this was kind of a lifestyle for him.
well, he's definitely got a harem.
No,
Oh, drunk a lot? Yeah. This is, it means he throws a party here. Oh, it's Esther's party, but he's throwing another party, right? Have you ever known people like that? Right. I mean, that if you were the king, this might be your thing. I mean, we see people today who are in positions of power and authority and have wealth and all that. And we've seen some very horrific things We could bring up some things that happened over the past, I don't know, 5 to 7 years of people who owned islands and did all kinds of very bad things because they were rich and they believed they could get away with them. So yeah, bad behavior for kings, that's nothing. Yeah, this is probably a very frequent occurrence. Let's have a party, you know. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm whatever. But in the midst of that, he's making a bad decision. When he comes to his right mind, he sobers up, and then he misses his wife, the queen. Now, he's got a harem. That's not the issue, but there's something about the queen. Notice that there's something about a special woman who would be queen above all the other women. You get into the cultural things, but there's concubines which are not on the same level. They're just not. They're not what we would consider like just girlfriends or something. They're kind of married, but because nobody else can be with them but the king. But there's something special about the queen. So he's upset. He's probably, you know, like, oh, I know what she did. I'm angry about that. How could she do that? But I'm also angry because now she's forever away from me that way. And so these guys come up with a plan. Let's just get another woman. And what we'll do is we'll send out for all the beautiful women, right? All the young virgins, we'll send them out. And what does the king think of that? Oh yeah, pleased them. Sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. Let's do that. So they do that. Now, what information does the passage give us about Mordecai and Esther's family and their background? They were Jews.
They were taken captive.
Yeah. Jews that were taken captive. Yes. Yeah. So we've got things that are connected together. Absolutely. What is the tribe that Mordecai is from? Who's a famous king from Benjamin? Okay. We're not going to go down this trail, but if you're taking notes, we're going to see that Haman, do a little study. Haman's family lineage comes from the people that Saul was supposed to decimate, get rid of, wipe off the face of the earth. And he didn't. Interesting. Now, I think there's a reason why Mordecai's family history is given in some detail here, specifics about being a Benjamite, and Haman is the one who is going to try to perpetrate some wrongs against the Jewish people as a whole. This would be a lesson for another day. Do what God says, and you won't have to worry about consequences for the future. Do what God says now, and your generation coming after you may not have to deal with some consequences. So I think there's lessons to be learned there. Teach your children, raise your children, next generation. There's some important things there, but do what God says, and then we don't have to worry about these strange consequences that might happen afterwards. So something for you to look at in the future there. Why do you think this, other than what I've just said, why do you think it's important that this information is given?
Say that again.
Why do you think it's important? Not thinking about going all the way back to Saul, but it's the information that's given about Mordecai and about Esther's background and their family. Why is that? Why do you think that might be important?
Oh, because of what happens later.
Yeah, I mean, most of us know the story anyways. This is what's called foreshadowing.
Probably if that had been known, Esther wouldn't have been chosen.
That's probably a pretty good, you know, she's a part of that captive people that's been dragged off. So that's a good possibility. She might not have been.
Wasn't that why he told her to keep it a secret and not?
Could be a good reason why he doesn't want her to tell what she where she comes from, her ethnicity. It's very likely that Mordecai knows that there is racism. That's something we don't have to deal with today, I know, but back then they had racism. Right, that's a joke. We deal with that today too. But there's always been racism and not even based on ethnicity and things like that. That's there as well. But just there's always been classism as well, where people of higher status look down on people of lower status and vice versa. And there's always been these different kinds of tribes. We break off into tribes, and it could be about skin color, it could be about ethnicity, but it could be about social class and status and all those kinds of things. We break off into those things, and that's what's going on here. So it's likely that Mordecai understands she might not be given a fair shake if she's understood to be a Jew. That could very well be. All right, so when it was her turn to go into the king, what does she do? In verse 15, you could look at verse 15. What's she do?
She didn't ask it for anything on her own. She let the head dude do it for her.
Yeah, she didn't ask to bring anything of her own. She was going to take the advice of probably someone who knows what he's talking about, right? This guy's in charge of things. He probably knows what the king likes, dislikes, what would turn him off. Don't bring your teddy bear in, okay? King probably won't let, whatever it happened to be that he told her to bring or not to bring. She's going to listen to that. Is there something there for us? What do you think we might learn from what Esther does there? What's the positive in what Esther does? Verse 15.
I think it's a humble approach.
Okay.
It's using wisdom.
Yes, using wisdom.
Somebody else knows facts and more information than you do, you will for them to take their lead.
Doesn't that sound like a smart thing to do? Right. I mean, that sounds like good advice. I have no clue how to fix a car. If I go to a reputable mechanic and he says this is what you got to do, it's probably a good idea that I don't say, no, we're not changing the oil. We're going to change the air and the tires. But you need an oil change. But I think it's right. But yet we do that in life, don't we? We might come across people who know more than we know, who've been where we've been, and are trying to instill some good advice. Maybe it's the advice, don't do what I did. And that can be hard to swallow, but that might be a good thing. So those who have knowledge, those who have wisdom, we might want to listen to what they have to say, even if it doesn't make sense to us. We might want to listen to what they have to say. Sure.
Because he obviously favored her and she trusted him. I mean,
Sure. There's a
because
trust.
somebody knows a lot more doesn't always necessarily mean they're going to give you the best advice.
Well, sure, we could talk about, shady characters and whatnot, but, we're talking.
They have built,
Yeah.
they have built a relationship.
Sure. And given the best, the person with the knowledge, the best motives, I use the example of a mechanic who's trustworthy, a reputable guy, right? Not somebody trying to take advantage of me and claims to have knowledge and all that. But it's always a good idea to think about the people in our lives who might know more than we know and to maybe submit to what they say. This is a good idea, do that. Okay, maybe I should do that. So she does that. It's humble. She's not being arrogant. She's not being prideful. She's not being boastful. There's probably some trust there. She's interacted with this guy, and she's going to say, all right, whatever you think I need to do, I'll do that. So she does it. All right. So in everything that we've seen in this chapter, how would you describe Esther's character? We haven't looked at everything, but we read the text. Just the overall feel and flavor. What kind of a person does Esther come off as? What's her character like?
Well, I like the humble, like you said, the humility and the humbleness.
Yeah, definitely. There's a humility that goes on there.
I think, and I just kind of pulled this out of about Mordecai. I mean, I think she's respectful and
Yes. Yeah, that's in there. You pick that up, right? Where it says, even though she's really out of his care in a sense, she still obeyed what he said.
Like she had
Yes. So even though she is an adult, she's going to be part of the harem, at least part of the harem, right? She might actually be queen, but she's no longer really under Mordecai's authority. And yet she's still respecting her elder, her father, her adopted father, in a sense, the guy who's now taken her under his wing. So there's definitely there of respect for, we could even say honor for a parent figure, right? Honor your father and your mother. There's an honor there. There's a respect there. She is obeying. She's obeying her father, her adopted father, right? So yeah, that's a big thing there too.
Things that you don't see come out from her, and just reading into this a little. If you think about a lot of women trying to see one person, to be selected, there can be some strife, some, like one-upmanship.
Sure.
I don't know. And also, if you're a beautiful person, you know it. It's like, if she carries herself with humility, back to that. She's not like, well, he should pick me, we all know.
There's a dignity.
Yeah, there's nothing like that comes out of her at all.
Yeah, there's definitely that. You definitely get the sense of a humble woman. I don't think she thinks I'm ugly, nobody likes me, everybody. I don't think she has, what we would say a bad self-esteem or something like that. I think she's got probably a balance. Yeah, right. I should get this, or yeah, there does seem to be a balance in the way she grew up as a captive. Absolutely. Yeah, her people are, even though she's part of the chosen people, they're part of the exiles, people who are in captivity. Absolutely. So
she reminds me a lot of Joe's counterpoint
yes,
in slavery, and
yes,
handsome and maintained his integrity. And here's a woman in a society that is patriarchal, and she's maintaining her purity, her dignity, everything in the face of that.
Yeah,
Which
great
tells
point.
us that we can do that too.
Absolutely,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
The church can be that way, and
Sure.
but she's a character that reminds me so much of Joseph.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of it, but you're absolutely right. You got both of them who are in places of bondage and captivity, and yet they're rising through the ranks, doing godly things and not getting involved with maybe the ungodliness that's going on around them. That's a good point.
This is not, and I understand, okay, at the time, and all these women were chosen, and they're all finding favor in the king and his harem, but does it not bother anybody else that Mordecai throws her to be chosen for a harem?
Well, he doesn't throw her to be chosen for a harem. He puts her in there to be chosen as queen, which would be a better position in life for her.
But they each go in and have their night with the king, and I don't know, it's just a little bit.
Well, think about definitely a different culture, different period of time in history. Very common. It wasn't anything uncommon. In fact, we even have King David and Solomon who have many wives and concubines. It's not an unheard of thing. And what is her life going to be like if she's not part of the king's special group? Is her life going to be better or worse on her own?
It's going to be worse.
It's going to be worse.
It's going to be worse. So what is he trying to do in the mid? The problem with us is we're looking at this with 21st century eyeballs. You can't do that. Can't do that. You got to go back in time and put yourself there. Her life would not be better off not being part of the king's special ladies, his wives, however you want to put it. But Mordecai also wants the best for her. I don't think Mordecai is going into this.
Because I think that you're right. I think
Yeah.
he saw her as his daughter.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a.
It's a cultural issue that you have to get over. What we cannot do is read into the Bible what goes on today. That's where we get into trouble. That's where we get into the problem of thinking God is a male chauvinistic pig, and these people were. God is for women. Over and over and over again, we see that even in cultures that downplay the role of women or abuse women. God is putting in provisions and providing for women all along. In fact, he's got a special woman who brings the Messiah into the world. He's got women who go to the tomb and proclaim the resurrection of Jesus when women's testimony was suspect, at the very least. And they're the first ones proclaiming the good news of the gospel and those things. So this is really where we have to say, okay, if I were back then, without my preconceived 21st century notion of what right and wrong is in our day and age, what would be a better life? Well, she's probably going to be a poor peasant, because most people in the ancient world were poor peasants, may very well have been an indentured servant, a slave. And some slaves were very well taken care of, some were not. It was a range back then. But being part of and possibly being the queen is going to be far better for her. And that's Mordecai's motivation. What is the best for my daughter, right? Quote unquote, what's the best for her? I want the absolute best for her. So that's what we have to understand going on in this text. I know all the issues we might pull out from there, that we don't like it, doesn't seem fair or whatnot, but there's deeper things going on here that we don't understand, not being in that culture. So. All right, so what did King Ahasuerus think about Esther, and how did she become queen? 17 through 18 is the text there.
He pleased her, but she pleased him a bunch.
Yeah, she's beautiful. He loved her more than the others. Something's going on there. She's finding favor in his eyes, right? Favor. So she's taking all the advice of everybody that's around her. She's submitted to them, and she's going in. Yeah, she's beautiful. But I'm sure there were other women who were beautiful. But is it possible to have a beautiful person, man or woman, who is obnoxious or is just nuts, or is something wrong with them? Is that possible? That
Yes.
might be possible. That might
Yes.
be. Yeah.
Yes.
So just because she's beautiful doesn't mean that that's the only thing he's thinking about. I'm sure there were others. But anyways, there's a lot going on in the midst of this whole thing. But he sees her, he loves her, thinks she's beautiful, loves her more than all the others. We're running out of time, but I want to bounce quickly and talk about what is going on in verses 21 to 22. In 21 to 22, I'm going to just talk about it because we are running out of time. We've got a plot to kill the king. And who finds out about that plot?
Mordecai.
Mordecai does. What does Mordecai do? Tells Esther. Esther goes in.
Tells the king and gives Mordecai credit.
Right, Mordecai, which says something about Esther again. We're seeing her character over and over again, right? She is going to present this information to the king. There's a plot to assassinate you. Oh, by the way, didn't come from me. I didn't find this out. I didn't figure this out. Mordecai did. Mordecai did. So there's this whole plot. And why do you think this history is introduced? Because it almost seems to be a bit disjointed. It doesn't have anything to do with harems, doesn't have anything to do with picking a queen, but there's this kind of little plot that's added in there. Why do you think this might be added in? Yeah, it's going to be connected. There's a foreshadowing of events that are happening. And this sets us up for, first of all, Mordecai is a trustworthy guy. Esther is a trustworthy woman. And this is going to set up some things in the future. And in all of this, what we should be able to see is it teaches us about the sovereignty of God. Now, really briefly, what does God's sovereignty refer to? What does that mean when we talk about God being sovereign or his sovereignty working out in a situation?
He's overall, in all.
He's in control.
Yeah. Online, what you got?
He's in control.
Say it again. In control? Did you say in control?
he is in control. He understands what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, he's in control. In fact, we often talk about not only sovereignty, but we talk about the providence of God. When we talk about the providence of God, what are we talking about?
All things work together for good.
All things work together for good. We're talking about God working behind the scenes, where we don't see him explicitly. We know God's working when the Red Sea parts. That's obvious. We know God's working when there's 5,000 men, never mind women and children, who are fed from a couple pieces of fish and some bread, right? We see that. God's working miracles, yeah. But here we see in Esther, God working behind the scenes. We don't see him. In fact, the name of God is how many times mentioned in Esther?
None.
We never. This is the book of the providence of God. God working out things in the background, underneath, never overriding people's free will and choice and all that. But he is doing things that are bringing about a good result through people who are faithful to him, right? He's using people who are faithful to him. And wicked people are doing what they want to do, but God is working behind the scenes. So this is a great book to see the sovereignty of God and to see the providence of God. And that's important for us because we don't often see God working in big ways in our lives. Sometimes we can see things and say, wow, I think God was working there, it kind of worked out or whatnot. But a lot of times we just go through life day to day. We might not think God's very active. Well, in the book of Esther, that shows God's always active. God's always doing. There's something going on behind the scenes that we don't always get to see. I don't think Esther had a clue that God was going to use her to rescue people later on. And who knows what God is using you for that you may or may not even know about in 10, 20, 50, 60, 100 years from now. We don't know. What kind of example have you set? What kind of life are you living that others are seeing it, that others are impacted by it, that others are coming to Christ and you didn't even know it? You didn't even preach the word to them, but you lived out a godly existence. They believed you were a Christian. You said you were a Christian, and you lived a certain lifestyle that proclaimed the gospel, and somebody was changed. Right? We just don't know. God is working, though. That's the big picture. God is always working. All right. Here is the homework question. What is one thing you can do this week to better conform your character to that of Christ? What's one thing you can do to better be conformed to the image of Jesus this week, to be more in line with his character? We saw character today. We can't say I can't be a Christian because the world I live in is rotten. Because Esther lived in a pretty crazy world. And yet she was a morally upright woman who was submissive and humble and all of that. That make sense? Think about that this week. Put it into practice. How can I be more like Jesus this week is what we're really saying. Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns before we wrap this up? Okay.
You did good.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate that.